Hello and welcome to all of you. I'm Suhag, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Lambda Test, and I'll be your host for this session. As we move to the last session of TestMu 2023, I would like to thank you for making this second edition of TestMu so amazing and engaging. But the fun is not over yet. We have one more exciting session with our guest and my dear friend Solomon. So to talk about Solomon is a lead backend engineer at Andela with over 5 years of experience. He has ventured across multiple front-end and backend technologies, crafting high-performing, scalable, and innovative products. He's a founder of masteringbackend.com and the author of very insightful book, Architecting Vue.js 3 Enterprise-Ready Web Applications. So it's a must-read from my end. Solomon has been our go-to technical expert and a very respected industry leader. So I'll discuss some little about session so that what to expect, set the expectations. So we'll start with the basic question, like what exactly should you test in large-scale Vue.js applications? And then we'll deep dive into best practices and strategies for enterprise testing with Vue.js. So before we go ahead, some hygiene items. If you have any questions, feel free to head to the Q&A session. You can see that on the right side of your screen. We'll discuss them towards the end of the session. If we are short of time and some questions get unanswered, you can head over to the Lambda Test community thread. For this session, I'll be sharing the link as well in a while. And yeah, don't forget, you will get recordings of all the session of TestMu on our YouTube channel. So make sure you are subscribed to that. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Solomon. Over to you, Solomon.
All right. Thank you very much for having me, Valma. So I will just start by sharing my screen now so that we can quickly get to it. All right. First, I want to thank everyone for joining my session and also joining the TestMu conference. It's really amazing here. For the past 3 days, we've been talking about testing and testing and testing. So today, I'm going to be talking about scalable enterprise testing with Vue.js and how you can do it from a beginner's perspective down to how you can be conversant with it. And we'll look into some of the best practices and strategies that you can use to achieve something like this. Okay, before we start, let me just run through a quick introduction. My name is Solomon Eseme. I'm a senior software engineer at Andela. I am also the author of Architecting Vue 3 Enterprise Applications. And I'm also the founder of Mastering Backend. So Mastering Backend is a company that give out great resources and next backend engineering training. All right, so in this talk, we are going to be looking into overview of testing, and then we are going to look at why you should test. And after that, we'll look into what to test and what not to test also. And then we are going to try to write some tests, and see how the processes look like in using Vue.js as the framework of choice. Okay, so let's start with the overview of test. First, you are going to be talking based on these 3 types of testing: the unit test, the integration test, and the end-to-end testing. So for unit test, it is a method of verifying the smallest piece of testable code against its purpose and requirement. All right. So throughout the conference, I believe that we've been talking about this different type of testing. And again, integration test is a type of test that tests in which the different units, modules, and components of the software under test are combined and tested as a single unit. So while you have unit test, that test every piece of code that you've written, majorly the functions or the methods in your application, the unit test runs that. Now, when you want to combine these different components together, so I'll be using components a lot because we are dealing with Vue.js. So for example, your unit test, you use it to test your buttons, your forms. Now you want to combine them together to form a a more larger component, right? So that is where integration test comes into play. Now you're no longer testing individual units, but you're testing them joined together as a single unit. And then end-to-end testing is a methodology that assesses the working order of a complex application from start to finish, right? So end-to-end testing is totally different from the above tests that I've mentioned, because here you specifically test the features or the requirements entirely from start to finish of an application, right? So we are going to look at some examples to understand these different tests. Okay, so the next big question is, why should you test, right? So if you have end-to-end testing, you have unit testing, you have integration testing, why is it even important to write tests when you can simply do manual testing? As software engineers, we write our code and then maybe we test it in the browser and see if it works. So why do you need to write separate tests or code another test or stuff like that? So for unit tests, number one is the expected behavior that you want for your application, right? So you want that behavior to be the same even if somebody else uses the code base, right? So if someone comes to use the code base, or if another maintainer comes to make changes to the code, you want the expected behavior or the expected requirements that was specified to always remain the same. Because if somebody changes something on your code base and it affects the behavior, the test is going to fail, right? And the person would know that, okay, this is not the expected behavior. And that's the reason why we need to write this test. If you do manual testing, when someone changes the code on their own terms or on their own way of writing code, the person will do their own manual testing, and sometimes it might be correct, but it's not what the requirement is, or it's not what the application it's supposed to be. And the person might not know because there is no test failing for his implementation. And then we have, it also helps you to write clean code, because if you look at, sorry, I didn't mention that this this slide is basically a snippet from my book. So in the book, I basically explain how you can structure your projects for a large-scale system and make it testable, all right? So because you know that you'll be writing tests for this particular project, you need to structure the code in a way that is what? Testable. And that helps you, or that enforces you to write clean code. And at the same time, helps you to write better code. And then for integration tests, it helps you to improve system reliability. Because if you have two different components, for example, you have a pop-up, you have a form, and then you have a button, these three components, for example, coming together to form one registration or one login page or something, right? So once you write integration test that is valid, and then it shows that these three components that comes together works, right? So that makes that system reliable in the sense that if somebody changes any of these components in future, the test might fail depending on what the person changed, or it might still pass. So if the test failed, that simply means that something is wrong. But if the test passes, that simply means that whatever the person did is right, and that makes the system to be what? Reliable. We don't push bulky code to production when there is a proper and written test. All right. So next, it helps you to reduce lots of data loss and increase scalability. And then on end-to-end testing, you notice consistency in user experience. For example, if you have to test the entire checkout system on your website, right? So you know how a user is going to interact with your checkout feature, and then you write the test accordingly. So any point during the testing that is not nice, or the experience is not great, you will notice it because you are the person writing the test, and then you are going to change it and make it user friendly and the experience great. And then it also ensures the correctness of the application, because you're actually testing it and then showing it to yourself that this is how a user is going to interact. Though I understand that users have different ways of interacting with the application, but at least there is a requirement that was specified for that particular feature, and then your end-to-end testing is ticking those requirements accordingly. All right. So next, this is a very big question when it comes to software testing. What should you actually test? What to test when writing tests? So I'm going to try to break them down in 4 different formats. The first 2 is for unit testing and integration testing, while the last 2 is for end-to-end testing. Right. For inputs, if you look at a particular feature, a particular component rather, let's say a form, you notice that what the user can see is basically if the user is filling out the form and there are supposed to be error alerts or something like that, maybe a message showing that, okay, what you filled is not correct, or your password remains capital letter or stuff like that. A user can actually see that, though a user cannot really interact with it, but a user sees that, and that is important, all right? So you need to test to make sure that that stuff that the user sees that is important is actually displayed, or it is shown according to how it's supposed to be. You can, for example, if you're filling out the form and the error message is displayed at the top or maybe at the bottom, you'll notice that that won't be correct, because that is not the appropriate place that is supposed to display. And then another thing that you need to test is what a user does. So a user can click a button on your form to submit the login details, right? So you need to test to make sure that the submit button actually works, right? And the next one is the output of what the user can do. So if a user submits a button, then what happens, in the case of login in feature, when a user submits a button, 2 things maybe should happen. First, the first one is the user is logged in successfully, so it's redirected to maybe the dashboard page, or the user receives an error and an alert is displayed. So this is what you need to test. You need to test when a user clicks a button, this happen and that happen. So you don't have to test the colors, the placement of the buttons and stuff, and maybe how the design looks like. And you don't also have to test the implementation of how these things are being done behind the scene, but you need to test the result. You need to test the important things that the user can see on the page and the important things that the user can do on the page. So that's for integration tests and unit testing. Now for end-to-end testing is kind of different, because here you're running through the core features of the application one after the other. For example, you're testing the checkout system, the login authentication system, maybe login and register, and then you're testing the payment system, all these core features. That is what you're running through when you're writing end-to-end testing. So first, the requirements. If you're going to test a payment system, what are the requirements for a payment system in our application? So the first one, for example, could be the payment goes through and the user is maybe redirected to a dashboard, or the payment didn't go through, the user is sent an error message through an email or stuff like that. So these are the different things that you need to incorporate when you're writing your test, because at this end-to-end testing, you're trying to make sure that you start from where the user is supposed to start, and then you run through how they are supposed to run through the application to the last of how they are supposed to finish the application. So next, we are going to look at what's not to test. So we have series of things that you need to test as you're writing your software testing, but what are the things that you don't need to test when you're writing tests? Okay, so we have implementation details, right? How the code is created, how the code is developed inside, maybe if you're using object-oriented programming, how the functions, how the methods are created, how the classes are created. You don't need to test all that, all right? Those are kind of hidden. You don't need to test them. And another important thing when you're writing unit tests is you don't need to test the API return values, because these should already be tested on the back end or wherever the API is coming from, if it is internal, right? And then you don't need to also test external libraries because, of course, those should also have their own test. And then under integration test, you don't need to test the designs. So if you are integrating two components together, you don't need to check, you don't need to test the design of these two components again, but the functionalities of the two components. That is what you should test. And you don't need to also repeat unit level functionalities again. So if you have a form and a button, for example, that is joined together, you don't need to test the individual functionalities of the two, but you need to test what the combined functionality if they work as you expect them to work. So there are lots of things you don't test while doing integration tests, but I just limited it to these three. You don't need to also test security because like doing penetration tests and security tests and stuff like that, because these also have their own separate testing procedures. And then under end-to-end testing, so since you're testing a complete feature, you don't need to test all the pages that makes that feature functional, right? You only need to test the functionalities, the things that a user is supposed to interact with to access that particular feature. And again, you don't need to test the designs, like how the color, if the color is red or if the color is white, and how these different layouts and how they are laid out together. So you don't need to do all that test. You just need to focus more on the functionalities and the requirements that was specified. So next, I try to give you a clear example of this different testing and what you should be writing tests for. So for unit tests, you don't have to, test a user opens a form, a model pops up, they impute a name, they click submit button and gets taken to a different page. So you don't do this when you're writing unit tests, right? The thing you do is a model renders when an input for a name. So a model renders with an input for a name. That is one test, right? And then a button to submit actually exists. That is another test and is clickable, right? So when you click that button, an API is called, for example. That is one test. When the button is clicked, the model closes. These are specific functionalities that you need to test out one after the other. And then for writing integration tests, you don't need to do this individually. For this other side, a model renders with an input for a name. You don't need to do that individually, but you need to do it as a unit. So you now look at these parts that you see do. So a user opens a form, a model pops up, they impute a name, they click. This is the way you run your integration test, because a form can be a separate entity, a separate component, a model, a separate component. The different inputs and the click button, they are all different components. And at this time in integration test, you have joined them together. So you test them as one unit, right? So that's what you do when you're talking about integration test. And then for end-to-end test, you don't also test, you don't also do it this way, like a user opens a form, a model pops up. No, this is what integration test does. But what you do is you look at an entire checkout feature, and then you look at the different ways that you allow users to interact with your checkout feature, and then you test it like that. And then you also look at the requirements and the functionality of that checkout feature, and then you run your test from start to finish. And the same thing for your login feature, maybe payment feature, etc., and other features that you might have on the application. So for Vue, there are different test tools that you can use. For example, everyone knows 𝐻𝐿, 𝐻𝐿, Mocha and stuff like that. But because of the law of predictability, that's from my book also, I always tend to use tools that are approved by the frameworks standard or community. So we have Vitest, we have Vue test utils, we have Vue testing library. So these tools are specifically made for Vue, except for some that has other frameworks. So it allows you to mount, the components, right? And it allows you to do assertions on these different components and also the data of these different components, right? So I use Vitest for my unit testing, and then I use Vue test utils and Vue testing library for integration testing. And then for end-to-end testing, I basically use Cypress for end-to-end testing. Okay, so what are the strategies for you to write your test? One thing I do is I first of all do scaffolding, right? So when I want to write a particular feature or a particular thing in my code, I do kind of a scaffold to show the different behaviors of that particular task and what the user is going to interact with and what the user is going to see that is important. I'm not talking about the colors and stuff, but something like an alert, error alert, that is very important. So I'm going to write out the scaffolding using describe block to show these different things that are expected. Okay, so something like this, I saw this online, I said, no, let me use this. So for example, if you're looking at nav item, they are testing the nav item, you can write a describe block like this that basically shows everything that you expect the nav item to do. So here you see something, it renders an icon. So assuming the icon is very important, I don't think that's very important, but assuming it is, then I'll write a describe block that shows that, and it renders the title. Now here, there is no test for it. I'm just describing the things that I'm supposed to do. And maybe when I'm done writing this nav item, I'll now start writing the test to complement these things that I have listed out. Okay, so here I'm supposed to show you guys some demo. Let me share my other screen and walk you guys through it. Okay, so for unit test, you can go to this page on GitHub, the chapter 9. This is a repository for my book. So it contains test, but first the unit test. So for example, let's say you want to test the card spec, like there's a card component here, and you want to test it. So what you do is, for the card, there are things that are important that should be displayed on the card. For example, a success status is important. An error status is also important. And then loading state is important. So things like this, you see that I'm testing
Solomon,
that.
I guess if you're showing some demo or something, your screen is not visible. It is stuck at the demo only.
Okay, sorry about that. Let me reshare this other page.
Yeah, sure. Please reshare it. Yeah, now it's visible.
Oh, yeah, so it's showing now.
IDs.
All right, so this is GitHub. Basically, is a page that the repository for my book. So this is chapter 9, like the branch chapter 9. So the chapter 9 contains unit testing. And here I'm trying to demonstrate the important things that you need to test in. For example, let's say we have a card component in your front end, and the card has a lot of code inside. But specifically, the important things on that card is it's supposed to show the loading state. It's supposed to also show the success state, and then it's supposed to show the error state. So these are unique things, and they are very, very unique. So they are specific to that particular card, right? So that's exactly what you test. I understand that on unit testing, you can test the methods, the functions within that card, But here, we are talking about the components, right? So we are testing the components, not basically the function and methods that is within that component. So here, the test basically checks, displays a card with a success state, if that is true. And here, it also displays a card with error state, if error occurs. So you see here, I'm trying to show you exactly to test what the user sees and also what the user can do. So in the last test here, a user clicks a button to create a pin, and this is exactly the test that covers that on that card component that we are testing. And then the next is the integration test. You can find that in chapter 10. So in chapter 10, let's go to components. We have home overview. So here, home overview is a component that has plenty of components within it. So what we are looking at here is that there is a button on the home component. There is a notification component, and there are also cards that displays 14 pins. So these are different components that we join together to form the home overview. And then we also have the search component. So here, we are trying to see that the component itself, that is the home component that has other components, is rendered, right? And then next, we are trying to see that there's a button on it, and that button is what? Clickable. And when that button is clicked, an API is called and it creates something, right? And then we also look at the notification because it is important. So when we click the X button, the notification actually goes away. This functionality happens, right? And then we also see checking that the 14 pins or the initial load pins that we want on that particular component is displayed. And it is also organized as we want our users to see them. And again, we also check in that the search component that is added on this large component is also displayed, and it contains a text search on that. So here, this is just a quick example to show you that while we have a larger component, or while we have a component that has been integrated with other components, these are the things that we test. We test to make sure that the components that are important, right, the component that the users are going to interact with in this big component are actually displayed, and they're actually tested also to see that the different functionalities actually happen as a unit. All right, so that's that for the integration test. And then next, let's look at end-to-end testing example to also see. So under E2E here, we have a login spec. So here we are testing the login features to see that, one, there is a success message when the login password and the username are valid, right? So that particular functionality happens. And then there is also an error message when maybe the email is wrong or maybe the password is wrong, and that makes it invalid. And we also test for that. So here you can simply see that we are not testing for a specific component. No, we are not looking for components in this case. We are looking to make sure that the functionality that this login feature needs to have is complete, all right? So the guy or the person is logged in if there is a valid email and password, and there is an error if there is a wrong email and password. And that is what the functionality and the requirements of that particular feature. And that's what we've tested. Okay. Yeah, so next. Here, I'm supposed to say thank you for joining my section, but because I am looking at this is a snippet from this book, and I just wanted to show you guys that you can get the full details of what I've talked about here in this book here. So architecting, you can't see that also. So I have to stop this. Share. Okay, so architecting Vue 3 enterprise-ready web application. You can get it from this. So here it shows you how to structure your project so that it is testable, and it does it from a beginner level so that you don't get lost in case you're just starting out building enterprise systems. All right, and this other one is under pre-order. So here I'm going to talk about different patterns and a lot more depth and details on how you can build scalable Vue.js applications. All right, so with this, I'm going to say thank you for joining, and I'll wait for your questions.
Hey, I guess that was very insightful session, I must say, for Vue.js. I guess we learned a lot today, Solomon. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience in Vue.js. I'm sure everyone has gained valuable insights, and they will put them to use. Just a reminder, everyone, we will be hosting all a recorded session on YouTube, so you can go back and access them whenever you want. So now I guess we can take some questions here, right? There are, I can see lots of questions. Let me just go through it. And, a very simple one, yeah. So just our audience wants to know, what do you use personally?
Okay, so in Andela, it depends. So Andela is like a network that gives out engineers to different companies, right? So in Andela, in the company I'm working with, we are basically going with Vite. So we use Vite for testing because one, it's kind of universal. You can test almost because we do micro front end. So we have React, we have Vue and different. So we use Vite for all of it.
Yeah. So let's move to another one. I guess lots of questions came. Yeah, this one. I guess.
Sorry, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
How do you approach
the balance between unit testing, integration testing, and end-to-end testing to create a comprehensive and scalable testing strategy for Vue.js application? This one, I guess, will take a whole session in itself.
Yeah. So basically, when you're looking at unit testing, for me, unit testing, I simply test the more like the methods of a part. I don't know if that's method. So if you're writing a component, right, the functions that are within that component, that's what I test, right? But for integration test, and I'll test, what the component is supposed to do, right? If I click a button, all right, what happens? That's what I do in integration test for personally, right? And then I use my unit test to test the individual functions that are inside each of those methods, each of those components. And then for end-to-end testing, like I said, I just run through the requirements using automated systems. I run through the requirements and the features of each individual features of the application. All right. So with this, I know that I'm going to create, I'm going to scaffold 3 different testing systems for unit tests, for integration tests, for end-to-end testing. And when I'm done with that particular feature, I just fill out the tests. That's how I follow through my own testing strategy. So I don't really go directly into TDD by writing the test out first. And then next, I am building the components. No, I don't do that. That's a lot of time. So I basically just write the scaffold and go finish the components, and then come back and write the individual test. That's what I do.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Let's take this one. So what considerations are important when selecting and implementing a CI/CD pipeline for Vue.js applications?
What considerations are important? So first, this all depends on the application you're building. Some application, like my applications, basically do I do LinkedIn. I do. God, I'm trying to. I'm trying to get through this. Selecting, implementing. So I implement LinkedIn is important. I implement after LinkedIn unit testing, after unit testing, integration testing, end-to-end testing, and then deployment to staging, right? And there is the manual QA guys who now test. After they will push it to master and that will deploy.
Yeah.
All right. So there's a lot more things you can add, but then it depends on what is important for your application.
Sure. That also makes sense. I have this one more question. I guess we can take a couple of more. Yeah. What are some best practices for structuring test suites in Vue.js to ensure the scalability and maintainability?
Whoa, there are lots of best practices. There are lots of best practices, but one way I do it is first, I make sure that I use a lot of descriptive names. Like, as you can see, I just describe what I'm doing. And then I make sure I avoid flaky tests. Whatever I write is what works, and it's what if you change the code or something, it doesn't disturb, or if you're running it through a pipeline, it doesn't fail, right? But descriptive names, using there's assert. There's one principle that I recorded in my book, assert, act, assert, and there's one like that. So it basically helps you, or it shows you how to organize your test. So first of all, you act, and then you kind of check, and then you assert. So I will share that. I don't know where I can share that once I get it.
So you can.
So maybe I'll
share your screen.
Yeah.
Or
So
the link. You want to share the links?
Yeah. Let me just share that link right now.
Sure.
I'm looking for it. Okay, so this is hard to just run through all the articles I've written and see that. So here, sending that.
Yeah, we get it. Yeah, it's article.
Yeah, it's so there's one that basically it's difficult to just search through this on real time, but there's one I wrote on JavaScript testing that contains a lot of principles. Sharing that also.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess let's hop on to another question. A lot many questions I'm seeing. Yeah, okay. This one is latest. I'm just hey Solomon, how you and your team calculate about maturity of your test over the period of time? How to measure its maturity using suggested design pattern or other guidelines is going up or down with the time? Basically, design maturity calculation. I guess this question is half. So I guess some bits are missing. But yeah, like broadly, how to generally calculate the maturity of your test. We can just take that in our head.
Yeah, so this is actually great. First, we don't, right? We don't. But what I can say is we have a separate QA guys that make sure that the tests are passing. So once your tests are passing, and we run it through our pipelines, and there's no flaky test on it, right? So it basically works, but it doesn't go to production, right? So there is a QA person that does the manual testing, all right? But in terms of calculating the maturity, we don't, right? Because the company, is kind of a startup. The company I'm assigned to, not the Andela itself. The company I'm assigned to is a startup, so you're kind of moving fast than doing maturity test calculations.
Sure. I guess we will take one more question and then we'll wrap this up.
Sure.
Yeah. So Santa is asking which unit test, integration test, with unit test, integration test, and end-to-end test in hand, how to determine which one can be used in a given instance?
Which one can be used in a given instance? Yeah, I don't quite get it. So
maybe it's more of a priority question that like you have to do everything, and then what should we do the first? Maybe.
Yeah, what you should do the first is unit tests. So if you're talking about priorities, it's always unit tests, right? So after unit tests, you can skip integration test and move to end-to-end testing. So, but integration test comes when maybe some of the errors that you might have missed when you're writing unit tests, right? That's when integration test is very important. So in terms of priority, for my team, if I'm to give priority, I would say unit test is very important, right? Because it is the base and the unit of test, and then end-to-end testing, because you need to know how the user would experience your application and then replicate it, and then make sure it works how you want them to experience it. And then integration test can come that connects the components together. It's fine, it's good, but if there is something you don't have time, right, that is not the top priority. Unit test is the top priority.
Okay. I guess here we get a very clear answer from Solomon. Never miss your unit test. Yeah. So I guess we'll call it the day for the session today. Thanks a lot, Solomon, for this very insightful session, and I'm sure everyone really loved it. I can see from the questions and comments that people have a lot more curiosity in it. So before just wrapping it up, wrapping the whole TestMu up, make sure that you head towards the Delta Awards winner announcement for your final dose of meeting the amazing leader of the global testing community. And till then, happy testing and great day ahead, everyone.